Um, Good morning and welcome to today's presentation, the ransomware ecosystem, the what, how, who, and why of ransomware. Shortly, I'll be handing over to David M., Principal Security Researcher at Kaspersky. Before we get started, just a couple of reminders. Please use the polls function to the right of your viewing panel to ask questions. And if you haven't already done so, click the theater mode button under your viewing panel to watch in a full screen. David, now over to you.
Thank you very much, Martina. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to take a sort of a high level of ransomware. I'm not going to dig into the specifics of the encryption used by this or that ransomware gang. What I want to do is to look at the underlying ecosystem that underpins ransomware, hence the title, the what, how, who, and where of ransomware. So I'm going to start by looking just at some numbers. And first of all, in terms of samples that we've detected sort of 2019 and 2020, it comes out actually at about an average of 2,225 per month. So not huge numbers. If we look at the number of attacks blocked, obviously we've got higher numbers there, but we're still not looking at massive numbers. So we're talking here about 45,700 per month. So it doesn't look numerically as though ransomware is a huge, huge issue. Certainly those numbers are way less than they would have been, let's say, 4, 5, 6 years ago. However, we've seen massive evolution of the threat over the last few years. And really, we've moved from this being a random speculative type approach where the attackers were looking to ensnare as many people as they could and maybe get a few $100 out of them, to one where they are focusing much, much more on particular targets and hoping by doing that, that they could actually target people who can pay more than that. So these new targets really, we're talking about a shift towards what is sometimes called big game hunting, this idea of targeting companies that can pay much more. And you can't target people in that way using the same techniques of this broad distribution. So they tend to adopt what are effectively pen testing techniques. So it's not random kind of distribution now. They will do their reconnaissance. They will aim to get persistence on the network of the target organization. Then they will encrypt computers wholesale, and they will tailor the ransom payment based on impact and ability to pay. So it's based on the knowledge that they have of the target. And that's why these ransoms are typically in the hundreds of thousands or actually even in the millions. Now, there's a bit of a misconception that, you know, when we talk about ransomware gangs, we're talking about groups which are tight-knit, coordinated, a bit like Ocean's 11, where, you know, one person is controlling all the threads. But actually, that's a bit of a misperception. What we're actually looking at is a sort of interconnection of modular groups, each who specialize in a different aspect. And in that sense, it's no different really to the legitimate economy, where, you know, you have people who are developers of one particular aspect, people who manage another aspect of it. You've got, you know, people who are hired in to do other tasks. You've got resellers. So there's a genuine marketplace. It literally is the flip side of a legitimate economy. So if it's a legitimate economy or illegitimate economy in their case, but if it resembles an economy, who are the players within this ecosystem? And, you know, we've got various groups involved, and I'll go through each of them just to give the overview. So if we start with the bot masters, these are the people who control networks of compromised computers. And that's really the starting point for this. So when we talk about targeted ransomware, actually, we're only targeting several steps down the line. The initial approach is actually to use these people who control these huge networks, and they're the starting point. So they will rent out or lease parts of their network to other people, in this case to ransomware gangs. So they will infect via email, they will infect via drive-by download. And then there are sort of various aspects of this, you know, so we've got infrastructure as a service, where, you know, they're storing illegal content or they're using computers as relays or proxies. We've got crimeware as a service, where they will basically sell it for DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service, or spam distribution. We've got malware as a service, where they're installing malware supplied by their customer on some of their computers. So it could be any of those models, actually. And typically they will get money based on the number of installations. So that botnet may be sold, segments of it may be sold to different people. And the prices could be 5 digits, which is cheap compared to the potential profits. The red team's job is to buy access to the target network from the bot master and then pick the target they think is most likely to generate revenue. And they will gain admin access if they can. They will look to move laterally such that they get their hooks into the target network. The analyst's job is really to find out the financial situation of the company, find out what's critical, find out where that is located, and actually find out what could be compromising information, which they could then use as a kind of additional blackmail, as a lever to ramp up the amount of the ransomware or encourage the target to pay. The developers, these are the people who develop the ransomware proper, and this is typically done on a per installation basis or for a cut of the ransom. And so, you know, when you talk about Crisis or Ryuk or Purga, these are the sort of well-known families. The packers, well, their job is to try and make it hard to detect this code. So they will add this packaged layer on the top, which is aimed at making it undetectable. And the ultimate is fully undetectable, but of course, they only need to make it undetectable by the security solution being used by that particular target, hence the importance of the reconnaissance. The support people, well, when the ransomware is ready, when they've got control of the target, the ransomware is ready to go, the red team deploys it, then the support team takes over and they handle all of the customer interaction. So the communication, putting pressure on the target, decrypting a sample file for them to prove it can be done, decrypting all the files, ideally when the ransom has been paid. And then finally, the money launderers, and their job, of course, is when the money is paid, typically in Bitcoin or some electronic payment, their job is to launder that, you know, for the various people behind the attack. So that takes us to the question then of what can be done about this. Well, generally, it's impossible these days to recover the data. It does happen, but it's a lot less common than it was 10 years ago. It's rare for them to make mistakes now in the implementation of the encryption. You could hope that your insurer will pay out. You could negotiate, maybe through an intermediary, a cheaper price. But of course, there's no decryption that they will decrypt. Sorry, no guarantee they will decrypt. And if they do, there's no guarantee they will decrypt everything and not come back for more money. So any incident response plan should really include everybody who's a party to this, and it's got to include, of course, alternative communication methods, because of course there's always the possibility that people who are in your network and have been for several weeks or even months might be monitoring everything you say. It's not helpful to focus on the initial breach because they may have been in your network for a long time. And the real question comes down to, well, how do you deal with the breach once it's happened? And backups are a key part of this. The backup basically will ensure that you can restore data. That's only part of the cost, remember, it's not the whole thing, but it could reduce the impact. But it's only viable if you've been practicing your restore procedures, you know that that backup can be reinstated. And of course, you need to know that the backup is offline, because if it's online during the attack, data on the backups could be encrypted as well. So you need to think about it being offline, maybe off-site, and maybe using magnetic tape or some other mechanism that isn't going to be subject to encryption. Proactive defense is vital. There is still, I think, a focus very much on trying to defend the perimeter and keep out attacks. But actually, it's safer to assume that the network will be breached. And so what you want to adopt, really, I think, is an approach where you assume you're breached and you set up processes in-house to prove or disprove that particular hypothesis. Now, that is going to mean not just technology endpoint protection, but also technology, anti-targeted attack technology, which is going to enable you to spot anomalies within the network at an early stage. Because actually, the point where the attackers are most visible is going to be when they're in the network. So, you know, one of my colleagues was telling me about an incident where the red team, the attackers, failed because the defenders noticed that accounting staff were running PowerShell scripts, which was really unusual. So things like that get flagged up are really, really important. So defense in depth, having something which is going to spot anomalous behavior on the network, also making sure that systems are patched is also vital as well, so that attackers can't exploit vulnerabilities in unpatched applications. And I would also say it's really important to focus on staff education. And it doesn't just mean, you know, a quick tick box exercise, but actually an ongoing development of a security culture, one where you're trying to shape behavior in all of its aspects, actually. So in terms of the future, it's easy to kind of look at maybe what is, you know, dreadful situations, sort of Black Mirror scenarios where ransomware gets married to IoT or connected cars or voting machines. And that's certainly possible down the line. But actually, think about more immediately what criminals could do with their earnings, so to speak. So, you know, if we look, for example, at a ransom payment, which could be $1 million, and you look at the cost of a Windows 0 day, which could be the same, then suddenly we're in a scenario where these attackers have access to funds which would enable them to buy 0 days, which previously would have been out of their pocket. So that's quite scary, really. Well, what about final thoughts to wrap up? Well, it's apparent that if a company pays a ransom, that the attackers are obviously going to monitor this. But one thing that they've started to do over the last couple of years is to threaten to leak information from the target. And sometimes they will do that and they'll post it on a website. It immediately becomes apparent if the target pays, because that leaking stops. So that could impact reputation. It's a signal also to other groups that you are willing to pay. So a systematic approach is needed. And it's important to realize in terms of payment of ransoms that every payment of a ransom validates the attacker's business model, and it will go on while those payments are being made. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and I'm certainly happy to open it up to questions if anybody has questions.
Thank you, David, so much. I've gained a lot of insight, and I'm sure our audience did too. There are a couple of questions, and let me start with the first one. What's the easiest and the cheapest defense to protect the company data against the ransom attacks?
Okay, I think really there are sort of three very, very core things for any organization, whatever its size. They are to protect endpoints, make sure you've got a reliable solution on there. Make sure also that systems are patched, because that's really, really important, because vulnerabilities in systems get exploited routinely by attackers. And the third would be to have a backup regime in place. And those three things, if you think pub, protection, update, and backup, then going to the pub, so to speak, is going to be your core for protection. I think layered on top of that is the whole issue of education, about educating people in-house about what methods are used by attackers, and getting people, for example, to use solid passwords and not to click on links in unsolicited messages.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. It's too bad we don't have time for any more questions. So it's time to wrap up this session for the lunch and networking break, kindly sponsored by our gold sponsor, Cisco. Please do take time to speak to our exhibitors, expert exhibitors through their showcase pages and visit their virtual trade show booths. We'll be back for the next session at 1 p.m. Thank you.
Thanks, Martina. Thanks, everyone.